りおしまい。
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Get the Mic, the only show where your host on the left, Owl,
and your host on the right, Brock,
dissect fiction for its mythological significance. In this episode, as usual, we're talking about Dragon Ball, and in particular, we're talking about episode 108, Goku's Revenge. Now, before we get started, if you like what you hear during the show, give us a like, subscribe to our channel by hitting the red subscribe button down below. We upload new episodes Mondays and Thursdays to YouTube and Tuesdays and Fridays to Rumble, so follow us on those platforms. I think that's pretty much it, though. Nothing else to say before we start. So without further ado, this is episode 108 of Dragon Ball, Goku's Revenge. So the first thing we see is up in the plane, Roshi flashes back to his earliest moments with Goku and Krillin. Then to their entrance into the Tenkaichi tournament. Just then, they spot the next ball on the radar, and back on the ground, Goku launches into an assault against Tambourine, running circles around him before launching him and spiking him into the ground. Tambourine responds with a breath attack that Goku easily dodges, though Tambourine thinks he disintegrated Goku in the process. Seeing that he will not be able to win the fight, Tambourine flees, but Goku uses the Noibo to launch himself up past Tambourine and obliterates him with a Kamehameha wave of his own. Yajirobe is angry that his meal has been destroyed, but Goku reminds him that if he waits, another demon will come for the Dragon Ball. So in this little set of events, we see Goku's revenge, but I think it's pertinent to note that Goku's vengeance comes so easily. It's almost made clear by Toriyama that this getting revenge on the let's say hand of Piccolo is not getting revenge on Piccolo himself.
Yeah, it's to show that the nourished heroic spirit is actually something that defeats this kind of by default, right?
Yeah, because this is only an appendage, right? It's not an actual mode of being itself. It's will subjugated to another's who's unholy, let's say.
It's interesting that Tambourine tries to run away because it sort of reveals him for the more I guess it's kind of the substantial nature underneath Piccolo's representation out here in the world, which is that it's really about winning. You know, he won't fight a battle to the end for the sake of honor, because there's really no honor in Tambourine. He's only fighting to win, and so if he sees he's not able to win the fight, he's willing to run away.
Well, it also involves the moral weakness of that challenge, right? A spirit who has adopted a completely unholy mode of being, um, which involves, like we've said in the past, arrogance, deceit, and resentment, being confronted with the truth in such a way as Tambourine is completely obliterates him. The truth being that his mode of being is not the way he should be, more or less.
Right, and the last thing that Goku does in his original assault, he hits him in the head and his eyes bug out. And it's to show that he's seeing in a way that he hasn't seen before. He's being enlightened in that sense. We see that all the time. It's really clear with Tambourine here how the eyes bug out of his head whenever Goku enlightens him as to what his position really is. And he thinks that he can use his breath or his spirit to undo what Goku's done to him.
Well,
But
let's say
Goku,
his primitive form of evoking his spirit into the world, right?
yeah, a malicious sort of evocation can undo Goku's
Almost
influence.
venomous.
Yeah. And Goku, of course, is like, you think I couldn't dodge something like that? And then because of that, he sees that there's really no chance for him to stand up against Goku's spirit. And he runs away because it's not really about who's best, but who can win. And when he realizes that he's not able to win this fight, that Goku has been enlightened to a nature of reality above what he can shock him out of, right? Because the way that someone like Tambourine wins is by surprising someone to his malice. But Goku's not surprised. Goku actually shows him that his mode of being sort of supersedes his malice, and that frightens Tambourine into running to flee back to Piccolo, but Goku doesn't accept it. Instead, he uses the Noibo to elevate himself above him as he tries to fly away, and then essentially uses his breath or his truth, right? He speaks the truth with his breath, and that reality that he points out to him destroys him completely.
And the truth being that his and by that I mean his as in Tambourine's spirit is not something that is substantial. It is insubstantial to be a henchman towards an evil god, let's say, in the face of the heroic spirit.
Right, so Goku speaks down to him in that sense. He shows him his way of being. And of course, because of the way that Tambourine is oriented, this isn't something that he can reconcile. He can't really integrate that
Well, he's
into
also a
himself.
demon. That's the other thing.
Yeah.
Because I think part of the definition of a demon, and it is I think indicative in the way I presented them in, let's say, our D&D campaign, is they're not something that has moral grayness. They have been completely absolved into the unholy trinity that they've adopted.
Right, their mode of being gets rid of the logos. It blurs lines. It doesn't care for an appreciation for being. It's really anti-being.
And so when confronted with that, they cease to exist rather than, let's say, um
Yeah, Tambourine couldn't be reformed.
exactly, precisely. And I guess we kind of did this in reverse order, but I do briefly want to mention Roshi thinking about Goku and Krillin. So we have to think about where Roshi is at this moment. He is confronting the evil that his master left behind. So to Roshi, this is really his responsibility. And he's already kind of broken up because both of his students have died where his responsibility was supposed to protect them.
Right, and he mentions this throughout the last episode and this episode, and I think even the next episode, that he is not necessarily convinced, but he believes it to be likely that Goku's been killed by what's happening in the world. And I think that that's sort of a representation of Goku, or of Roshi, not thinking that his expression in the world is one that would survive this sort of challenge. He doesn't really fully understand that Goku could handle something like this. Um, and it seems to be that, I mean, even in the last challenge that he gave to Goku, right, where he says, "Oh well, just don't use the Nimbus, haha," almost like a joke, and then Goku surprises him by actually being able to traverse the world without using the Nimbus. I don't know if this is something that Roshi could foresee happening, that Goku would be able to face Tambourine. What do you think about that?
It's it's pretty complex because on the one hand you have that aspect where it appears that Roshi doesn't think he's ready to face Tambourine, but really and in my opinion what I think it is and why he thinks Goku is dead is because the spiritual father instantiated no longer protects the world from unmitigated evil. And so he doesn't even know who Tambourine is per se, but he
Right.
knows that he's no longer keeping back the evil in the world and that Goku has his tail. He doesn't even know all that pertains in that.
Well, that's what Roshi thinks of himself, right? Because he has faced the henchmen of
Of him,
Piccolo in the
yeah.
past.
Mm-hmm.
And so he thinks that he wasn't good enough to teach Goku to resist the henchmen of Piccolo. And so he thinks it's likely that Goku could have been killed by this. That which it took him and Crane Hermit together to be able to fight off in the first place, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I think this is a doubtfulness that he has towards himself and towards his instantiation out
Oh,
in the
I see.
world.
You're saying his doubt in Goku is a reflection of himself.
Right. Any ability that Goku would have to resist this effect would come from Roshi teaching him to live the right way. And so Roshi's really doubting that he's been able to impart that to him. And there's a certain regret that we see, and it's going to build over time, but he doesn't explicitly say it, but there is a regret that Roshi has towards the lifestyle that he's lived precipitating this, and that he hasn't been on the path well enough. Sort of a fear that he hasn't been on the path well enough to teach Goku not to be defeated by this, right?
Well, and I would say it's also something that everyone encounters as Dragon Ball being analogous to the self. The master mentor teacher role is always plagued with doubt in that regard, right? That they haven't prepared their pupil, student, um, mentee well enough for the road ahead. And I think I see where you're going with that, and I'm not disagreeing with that point about Goku, about him thinking that Goku is unready or that he failed to prepare Goku for the task ahead. All I'm saying is that I think the next step that Roshi's looking at the next step in the process of this plunging the world into chaos and that whole aspect of it and dealing with King Piccolo's malice and evil himself, that Goku isn't ready for that. Like I said, he doesn't know who Tambourine is. For all Roshi knows, Piccolo came and killed Krillin, right?
Sure.
All we know is the mark of the demon was there.
Right. The reason that I kind of make a bit of a differentiation there is in the original sub, uh, I think Roshi points out that he thinks that it was the hand of Piccolo that did this to Goku. And so some of his hesitance is directed towards a hand of Piccolo and not necessarily specifically Piccolo himself.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's funny because the sort of the inverse of that is what Goku knows that transcends even
Well,
Roshi's
also,
teaching, right? Which is how he defeats
let's
Tambourine.
pause because doesn't Roshi tell him that he's too tired from the fight?
Yeah, that was his warning not to go into this.
So it could even be that Roshi knows that Goku could possibly contend with these spirits, but at the time, after contending in the Tenkaichi Budokai, he's not prepared to do so.
Which shows that he has a doubt that Goku could rejuvenate himself out in the world, out in the chaotic space, to be able to fight him in the first
That's
place on
true.
his own, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which,
Well, it, we're kind of going a little far in our speculation because
sure, I am reaching a bit there,
well
but it's
because if you say that Roshi knows that he has spent all his energy in the Tenkaichi Budokai, and then he goes right after that to fight a hand of an appendage of Piccolo, let's say, thinking that he's dead at that point is not something that's unbelievable. And I think that's kind of why it works here with Roshi thinking that Goku and Krillin have died. Because
Right.
it's like the perfect storm for Goku to lose, and to die, right? His friend was killed. He has no energy. He just competed in the tournament, right? His Nimbus gets destroyed, all of that, and so
So Roshi doesn't know that necessarily, that he doesn't have the Nimbus with him anymore.
that's true. Yeah.
But I agree with you, and I think that it's actually, it kind of makes it more mythological along those lines, where um it's really a question of, does the baseline of Goku's power supersede that of a demon who is born of this spirit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even a malnourished Goku can survive encountering this kind of spirit, but what Roshi's questioning is whether or not it's being sustained by that, right? Or that it's actually categorically something that can contend with it. And so it is a bit complicated, but I do think that this is Goku. Ultimately, it's a story of Goku surprising Roshi in what he's been able to integrate from his teaching,
I
and
mean, he
also
doesn't.
what goes beyond Roshi, right? Because he uses the Noibo.
Right. Well, let's say maybe not surprising Roshi, but exceeding his expectations.
Sure.
Because, I mean, Roshi won't know about this.
Right. But ultimately,
But
this
right, I
is
know what you
a
mean.
sequence of events that would surprise Roshi by his own
Right,
estimation.
so it exceeds it. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it exceeds the expectations. Right.
But then that he uses the Noibo is actually something that exceeds Roshi's influence as a spiritual father.
Correct. Yeah. And that goes with the earthly father that Goku has been adopted by, and that being Grandpa Gohan, and
And this is
using
an
that
earthly fight that he has to engage with.
he has been grounded back onto Earth at this point. So you're right. Yeah.
And this is a fight that he's doing as a representative for Yajirobe, who is an earthly representation of Goku's sort of heroic spirit. And so, yeah, I mean, this is all about that earthly representation that actually Goku's deeds in the world are actually coming to challenge the deeds of Master Roshi, I think, in that sense, because Roshi is a hermit. He's
Well,
separated from
and
the
that's the
world.
thing. This whole arc is really about Goku subsuming the responsibility of Master Roshi in the world at large, or let's say what Master Roshi represents, being the spiritual father that can hold
Right.
back the evils of the world for the people that exist in it.
Well, let's
And that's why this arc is so important, but we'll get into
well,
that.
I want to explicate that, because what happens, there's a balance there between Goku and Master Roshi, because the hermetic wise father separates himself from the world to gain the wisdom of what would be best to be enacted in the world. So the responsibility goes to the younger generation, or the hero, to take that and enact it in the world. And so between the two of them, they find a balance there. One has to be separated to have the wisdom, and one has to be integrated to enact it, and can't be necessarily as wise. And that's why Roshi is so doubtful, because he doesn't, it's entirely possible that Goku isn't wise enough, right, to survive in that embodied expression of goodness in the world against what Piccolo's bringing down now.
Which is let's say evil for almost for evil for evil's sake.
Right, it's destructive towards wisdom.
And it's a completely, and that's why he's the demon king, right? Is that he is antithetical to truth. He's antithetical to being integrated and being itself, right? All of those
Right.
things. And it's more so than Tao, because Tao was in it for personal gain. Piccolo's not
Right, it wasn't as
necessarily in it.
spiritual,
Yeah.
right, with Tao. Tao's a very physical instantiation of that, where he serves himself, and his the way that he affects the world is against other people's physical representations, but he isn't necessarily aligned against the mode of being by which people would make themselves better. He actually engages with it, right? We see that in the way that he mirrors a lot of rituals that Goku goes through. We see that with his ritual of like eating the egg in the bath, and we kind of
Mm-hmm.
talked about
Yep.
that before,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it's not so he's not necessarily spiritually aligned against betterment. He's a physical representation of being
Of malice, yeah.
confrontational and being malicious towards it. But
Yes.
Piccolo's an instantiation above because he sort of is trying to stamp out the idea of people trying in the first place to be that good.
Well, I would say, like, I would put it like this. Uh, Tao uses malice to further his own personal goals. Piccolo uses malice to further the proliferation of malice.
And which, well, I want to say to stamp out the willingness of other people to do that, to be heroic in the first place, right?
Right. And I
But see,
think,
here's the thing:
well, how do you do
the
that?
existence
And
of
what
the
does
hero.
Piccolo, and we'll see what Piccolo does in the next couple episodes.
So,
What does he do,
but
right?
I'll say the mirror of that is for Tao Pai Pai. The existence of a heroic character to take out is something that he relies on. He has a sort of symbiotic relationship with people that he would assassinate, right? There needs to be people who evil people would want to kill for him to be paid to do those deeds. And so he has a sort of relationship with it. But Piccolo doesn't. He wants to actually get rid of it. And so that's sort of how this is an escalation of that, I want to say, is in spirit.
Yeah, I agree. So let's go ahead and move to the next. Unless there's anything else we wanted to say here. One last thing, Yajirobe is pissed off that he's still hungry because Symbol wasn't enough for him to eat. So he's angry that Tambourine was completely obliterated, which again, talking about Yajirobe's hunger and appetite, it's because he's not nourishing himself with the proper things. And
Yeah.
that's also why he's a bigger character, let's say, looks more unhealthy, is because he is nourishing himself with things that are antithetical to the nourishment he needs. And so him telling Goku here this, it's almost as if Goku has kind of saved him from eating more junk food in this
Well,
regard.
he's sort of an embodiment of Goku's hunger, and it's not like he's going to be satisfied until Piccolo is eaten, right? And so there's an escalation that he's engaged in that is, as Goku realizes what needs to be integrated, he is a manifestation of that and wants to physically integrate it. And so, yeah, I mean, until Piccolo's defeated and he can literally eat a demon like Piccolo, he's not going to be satisfied. Now, we see an expansion on that as we go forward throughout this season, because it becomes more complicated. But I think as he is right now, it's like, okay, even if he was able to eat Tambourine, would he be satisfied? Probably not.
Definitely not, yeah. And so that's the last thing we see. And then the next set of clips here, we go back to Pilaf's airship, and Piccolo senses that Tambourine has been killed and commands Pilaf that they land the ship where it happened. Back in Yamcha's plane, Roshi and the Crane Boys follow the next Dragon Ball to a dark cave on the side of a cliff overlooking large spikes. As they try to land the plane, crows swarm around them until Chaozu uses his telekinesis to kill them all. Roshi and Tien venture inside to find a crow has carried the ball inside the cave, and they retrieve it, causing countless crows to then chase them back to the plane. So interesting enough here. This is a next kind of the next step that we see in the bird sign, and the bird symbology here is important for Tien specifically, because like we've said, this is really Tien's collection of the Dragon Balls.
This is a foreshadowing for what's going to happen in the next episode, I think, with Tien confronting the shadow of the Logos, right? With the shadow of the intellectual, or the societal effects of what he's done. And so he needs to be able to go into the cave, to confront the unknown, to take the assault of the dark bird, right, which is sort of the dark representation of the Logos, or the logic, or understanding the outcome of what he's done in the world. Um, and so it's sort of to ask him, can you emotionally deal with it? Okay, next episode we expand upon that
Mm-hmm.
upward to see
Mm-hmm.
if you can logically, more reasonably deal with it. But this is laying the groundwork for what's going to happen there, which is that Tien has done bad things in the service of his self, in the service of his ego, and we're going to start laying the groundwork for him to reconcile that.
Well, and remember too, this is an icy cave, so there's a couple things to note, right? Crows are like the lesser form, let's say, of ravens, being they are flightful birds, right? They do embody that logos
They're
idea.
intelligent.
But what is different between a crow and a raven? And I would get to that, the intelligence, right? A raven is far bigger and
Right.
far smarter than a crow. What can a crow do? The only thing a crow can do is caw, but ravens can actually talk. And so it's an let's say unrefined utterance that these crows exhibit in their formation here. And so we have this ice which is transforming, it's melting, right? And we're starting to see this transformation that Tien is going through.
A
And
continuation of what we saw before, which was a solid ice pyramid or
yes,
glacier that he had
that he had
faced.
to destroy. Now here we even see the ice melting in this scene, right? And so here we see them combating these let's say primal instantiations of malicious utterance. And Tien decides, instead of like killing them all, like blasting them all with a Kikoho, they decide to get out of there after they find the wisdom within. And it's a good way to introduce this idea that the wisdom that Tien is gaining is transforming him in a way that leads him away from being like these crows, because he was a crow, right? He was emitting very rudimentary utterances, being what he thinks is malice. That's how he started, and that's what a crow is in this regard.
Right. And his resolution with his relationship with the Crane Hermit was him having to say explicitly that he didn't want to be an assassin anymore, which was that he didn't have aimless malice that he wanted to instantiate in the world anymore, but rather wanted to take more responsibility for how he was going to change the
Which
world.
then, instead of just like repeating a caw over and over of malice, right, he started to become his own individual person, and that allowed him to separate himself from Crane.
Exactly. I think that's kind of what this scene is about
Oh,
because
definitely, yeah.
as they're running back, Master Roshi's being clawed in the head, and Chao Tzu tosses him his hat.
Yes.
And the hat is really interesting because the hat is something that Chao Tzu wears, and Chao Tzu is the one who is able to easily brush the crows off. Chao Tzu is sort of that childhood wisdom that is not necessarily fully integrated into Tien.
Right, because how would a child deal with, let's say, crude utterances of evil? They would think of it as a game, which is how Chao Tzu pretty much reacts to it here, right?
Right, and through his game-like or comical or joke-like response, he tosses his hat to Master Roshi and protects the spiritual father through the protection that is inherent in his more childlike understanding. And so there is an old and a young meeting that happens at the end of this that shows that Tien is able to understand the wisdom in a more primordial spirit of reverence towards the father.
Yeah, I agree.
So it
And it's a
really
really tight scene.
it's really simple. There's nothing super complicated about it. We see that for Tien and for Roshi, the answer to the heckling of the crow is within the wisdom that Chao Tzu has. And Chao Tzu is something that Tien needs to be integrating into himself in the same way that Bulma and Oolong are, or Yamcha and Po are, right?
Mm, it's a bit of a different. I think it's a bit of a different relationship because Oolong.
It's a continuation of it for sure. It's more
Well,
complicated
what I
and it's
mean different
higher.
is by type, right? Because I mean, you have Yamcha and Puar, and Puar is the feminine that needs to be integrated into Yamcha,
Yep.
and Oolong is the masculine that should be integrated into Bulma. But here we see the innocence that should be reintegrated into Tien.
Yes.
So it is. I see where you're saying, but it's not so much that Chaozu is a facsimile that
Right. He's not a facsimile of masculinity or femininity necessarily, but he is something that the only way that Tien has been able to instantiate himself in the world that he has is to ignore this aspect of himself. And there's wisdom that he's set aside that he has not paid attention to, and that's why he's gotten away with acting like he would be an assassin even though he's not evil, right?
Right.
And so that child is where that wisdom is that he can keep integrating into
Well,
himself.
right, and it not only is the innocence, but the lack of malicious conviction that exists in a child that Tien needs to reintroduce and reintegrate with himself to be able to surpass his mode of being and become the heroic spirit that he wants to be now.
Right.
And so, yeah, Chaozu is super important because of that. But I think, like, just that's what I mean by type. It's different because
It is different in type, but it is a representation of what the characters do, which is separate that aspect of themselves
yes,
and turn their attention away from it. And then they sort of that's what prevents them from being as good as, say, Goku, right? And I think that
yes,
Goku,
but there's going to be a
it's
certain
complicated
point.
for sure. Because
There's going to be a certain point where, well, I guess there's a certain point where all three of these character pairings need to move on, but there's going to be a certain point where Tion, there's going to be a certain point where Tien no longer necessarily needs Chaozu, because there's a certain point where innocence and compassion are no longer what propels one further. Whereas with Bulma and Yamcha, the things that they're lacking are always going to be propelled by the integration of those two spirits that are disembodied from them.
right, I agree. I think that it's more succinct with Bulma and Yamcha.
It's just different. Like, it's just different type. But I know where you're going with the
Yeah,
similarity
yeah.
for sure.
I mean, especially with thematically, what we're dealing with is the death of Krillin and the reintegration of what was separate from Goku. And so these smaller characters who seem to be attached to the larger character who represents an instantiation with something that they either keep separate or that's unintegrated or that they're in the process of integrating. It seems to be something that's just painted throughout the resolution of every character's story at the end of Dragon Ball. And we'll get deeper into that as we go forward, but I did want to point that out because it is it's something that over the course of especially like the next 10 episodes we're going to be dealing with.
Next 10, yeah, because we're about to hit some real bangers. So let's go ahead and get to the last part of this episode. As Roshi and the Crane Boys fly towards the next Dragon Ball, they discuss the possibility that they'll have to face Piccolo on this journey. Chaozu says that Roshi would win for sure, but Roshi explains that there is simply no chance that they would be able to win, even working together. He tells them their only chance is to steal the balls and use it to have Shenron destroy Piccolo. Tien says that he wishes they could use the Mafuba, and Roshi scolds him for thinking such foolishness. Meanwhile, Goku and the Yaj wait for another demon to arrive. Yajirobe tells Goku that he'll give him the 1-star ball if he kills a demon for him. But Goku doesn't notice as he sees a Dragon Ball arrive at their location on the radar. As he looks around, he notices above them Piccolo arrives in the airship, ready to punish them for the death of his children. And that is where the episode wraps up. So, a couple things here. Firstly, I want to mention that the Mafuba scolding incident with Roshi scolding
Yes.
Tien. Tien later on continues to pursue that aim. And it's interesting because something that we've been talking about recently, it being Elden Ring, is something that exists in Tien here, which is the flame of ambition, right? Tien desires to learn this thing, even though he knows it might kill him.
Yeah, I think that a there's a conflict in Roshi understanding that as far as he's able to see, using something like this, using a technique like this is something that you sacrifice yourself for. This is a process by which you would sacrifice the self to seal away the otherness in the world, to seal away something as terrible.
Let's take a historical example, right? How does Christ remove
That's what I was going
sin,
to
right?
say,
Because
exactly.
he commits the self-sacrifice.
And in
And
the process, he descends into the underworld to defeat the idea of death, right?
yes. And so, and in that regard, right, it is the evil containment wave. There's a reason why that's the translation for it, right? It contains evil at the cost of yourself. And you can think of this too. I mean, even if you want to talk about Dark Souls, Gwyn is almost committing an evil containment wave of sorts when he links the flame.
Well, what is the dark sign? But an effect of the evil containment wave, which is a border around a manifestation of human nature.
Mm-hmm.
And so, with using the dark sign, he does contain this evil emanation that comes from human nature at the cost of essentially cursing everybody with the undead curse, which can't wait to talk
We'll get
about
into
that.
that. We'll get into it.
I have a lot of thoughts about that.
Even the framing right now, I'm already ready to go.
Yeah,
So,
but this is why I love Dragon Ball so much.
uh,
Is how this shows up in Dragon Ball, that demon containment, and what to do about it, and how
oh
the
yeah,
archetypal hero responds to that call, right? Oh, it's
right,
just so good.
right, and even Tien here wanting to use it and wanting to learn it and wanting to commit that sacrifice. Roshi should not scold him here for this. Roshi only scolds him because he thinks it's his responsibility to deal with King Piccolo.
Ultimately, he doesn't want Tien to have to engage with learning this because that's what he is taking on right now.
Mm-hmm.
He saw his master go away for, I think it was like 2 years,
Mm-hmm.
to learn how to do this.
Maybe 20 years, something like that.
And so now Roshi knows that it's his turn, that it's a cycle that he's engaged with. And the last thing that he wants is for it to be something that is Tien's responsibility.
Or something even worse that eliminates the propensity for it to continue in the future. So eliminating right the next generation of heroes, especially because he thinks Goku's dead at this point.
Right.
So it really is Roshi wanting him to do that because kind of Roshi's a scaredy at this point. Roshi is scared that Tien will also die and that it will just be Yamcha, which is a very terrifying thought to begin with.
Right. And we see in Tien's thoughts that he recognizes that Roshi knows the nature of the Mafuba. He understands it, and so I think in this moment, whenever they're arguing about it, he realizes that ultimately Roshi is going to have to use the Mafuba. That before he would,
He's
right?
starting to piece it together, it's true.
That because he understands the true nature of it, that he's trying to protect him, not just because he says, "Oh, don't look at it," but because he understands it, and he would be able to do it himself, and that's why after this episode, Tien continues to press him. It's because he recognizes that he knows how to do it.
Right, and so we get to this last part of the episode where Goku and Yajirobe kind of just wait for Piccolo to arrive. And now this one thing I want to mention that's interesting here is is it in this episode where Yajirobe remembers about Piccolo's story? Or is that in the next one?
It might
It
be the
might be in the
next
next
one.
one. Okay. Yeah. So in that case, the only thing that I really want to mention here is the wisdom that Goku can gain by providing the proper sustenance for this unrealized, or let's say, oh, I don't want to use that word. It's gonna get us. It's gonna get us in trouble. So let me say, you know what I'm talking about. Let us say this stunted version of the heroic spirit.
Yeah, foolish.
Yes. And so, but as Goku being the spirit that he is, there is wisdom in being able to provide sustenance for a spirit like Yajirobe, especially the proper sustenance. And so Yajirobe offers to give him the 1-star ball, which is representative of that, if he can kill a demon for him. And so we've seen Goku kill Tambourine, we've seen Yajirobe kill Symbol, but it doesn't appear Yajirobe has put, or Goku have put all of this together in what is actually going on.
I like this. There is a sort of abdication abdication, I should say, that's happening with Yajirobe here, which is that if you can defeat this demon and provide him as something that could nourish me, give him to me to integrate and to become more wise, then I will give you the Dragon Ball. So it's Yajirobe saying, okay, you can teach me about this, and by doing so, that would mean that you're on the path. And he's saying, I don't want to do that. I'm not going to teach somebody else, but I'm willing to learn. Right.
Especially after seeing what Goku did to Tambourine, because Yajirobe is immensely impressed with Goku fighting Tambourine.
Yes. And so he's sort of like, well, if you can do that again and you can make him into something that I can integrate and expand upon myself, then I'll give you the Dragon Ball and I'll walk off the path.
Mm-hmm.
Which isn't to say that like he's not going to be good afterwards, but he understands the path to be seven times this, right? This over and over and over.
And that Goku's the driving force behind Goku is much more holy than his. He just wants the Dragon Ball because it looks good. But Goku trying to get revenge for his friend, even Yajirobe, who doesn't say it, but he can acknowledge the nobility in that cause.
But this is the thing. If he can control himself while defeating Tambourine, then he will be worthy of this Dragon Ball. And I think
Piccolo,
that's
you mean.
really, or just in this case, because he tells him if you can defeat a demon, right, like Tambourine, as far as Yajirobe's able to understand, if you can defeat a demon and give him to me to be able to integrate into myself, then that is enough to earn you the Dragon Ball. This is Yajirobe sort of accepting his role in Goku's story.
Right, and that's to say that I don't know if I don't know if it's necessarily that, because it can still be partially Yajirobe's story, but he's playing a different role, let's say, than specifically antagonizing Goku on his path, which is what he has been doing.
Right.
So he would be someone who is nourished by the heroic spirit's use of the conversion of chaos into order. The conversion of the chaotic spirit of a demon being turned into an orderly device used by Yajirobe to further his own ends. And so it's a holy thing, really, that Yajirobe asks Goku to do, and Goku really accepts it, but the only problem is it's not just another demon that comes down.
Unfortunately, not.
But Piccolo himself.
But yeah, I do want to just sort of add on to what you were saying, which is that what Yajirobe does originally is that he bisects Symbol with his sword, and then he eats him, by chopping him in half, or by bisecting him, or by splitting him apart, right? Then he integrates him.
He's able to consume the knowledge of that, yeah.
But when Goku defeats Tambourine, the way that he defeats him is the same way that Roshi defeats Fire Mountain, let's say, which is to destroy him completely, and not to be something that is nourishing of this, of the spirit that Yajirobe needs to be nourished by, right? And so Yajirobe says, well, if you can do that again, but instead of just destroying him, do what I do. Bisect him, define him, right? And by defining him, turn him into something that I can integrate again.
Well, let's say...
Because I want to point that out, that there's a difference between what Roshi does with Fire Mountain and what Goku does with Girin's village, right? Girin's mountain of water that he has, right? Because Goku uses his Kamehameha against that, but it's more articulated and it's more specific than when Roshi does it, right? He doesn't destroy the entire mountain. Instead, he can attack a specific problem. And so that's not something that Yajirobe fully understands on a spiritual level. He knows it on a physical level because we see that with Symbol. But he's basically telling Goku, if you can show me that again on a spiritual level, if you can define him and turn him into something I can integrate into wisdom, then I'll give you the Dragon Ball, which is wisdom, right?
Well, and
So he's acting that out.
The problem is, though, is that a demon has no nutritional value. And the truth of the matter is that when it's shown for what it is, a demon is insubstantial. And that's kind of what is shown with the Kamehameha wave and the fact that Yajirobe is still hungry after the fact that he eats an entire demon
Yes.
symbol.
Because Yajirobe wants to be spiritually enlightened.
Right.
But
that's not what you consume to be spiritually enlightened. Instead, you consume something else, which we'll see later in the season.
yes, I wanted to point that out because
Let's just plug it, yeah.
because we've talked about Goku's hunger. We've talked about how Goku
Hoku! Oh my
Goku,
God.
father of Hogan.
There's so many mess ups. Go ahead. Just go.
We pointed out how he's able to deal with that hunger and how to deal with the appetite and control his appetite. So ultimately, what would be a spiritual level of learning for Yajirobe would be to be able to control that.
Yes.
But it's not something he can learn from the demons, right?
Right, exactly. It's not even something he can necessarily learn from Goku. The nourishment that he's seeking, especially being mired in such chaos, is one of more of an orderly spirit that he needs to encounter.
Far more orderly than this.
But we'll get into that.
That's enlightened or heightened.
And so, as we said, the last thing we see is Piccolo is about ready to fight Goku, and it sets up the next episode really well, which is Goku versus King Piccolo. Anything else you got to say?
Nope, I think that's a good way to lead into what the next episode's going to be about.
I think we did a good job covering it. So if you guys like what you heard, give us a like, subscribe with that red subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications if you feel so inclined. We upload new episodes Mondays and Thursdays to YouTube, Tuesdays and Fridays to Rumble, so catch us on those platforms. I think that's pretty much it. So I'm your host on the left, Owl.
I'm your host on the right, Brock.
And we hope you guys have a good night.